In the 2013 movie Iron Man 3, a character named Trevor Slattery, under the guise and title of the Mandarin, spoke for an anti-American terrorist organization, where at one point in the film he says, "A true story about fortune cookies. They look Chinese, they sound Chinese, but they're actually an American invention, which is why they're hollow, full of lies, and leave a bad taste in the mouth." Now, it is true that fortune cookies, at least as we know them today, are in fact an American invention. And whereas we're not going to get into the broader context of what a fictional terrorist is saying about America, as a general rule of thumb, I have to agree that fortune cookies are hollow. It's pretty objective. Full of lies for the most part, and in my personal opinion, they do leave a bad taste in the mouth. So we're going to be opening at least one here this morning to read what we get. I had some extras I left in my office, so if we get something bad, this is what we're going with. I won't be eating this because they taste bad, and I have a microphone. I won't subject you to that. Seek out new opportunities for personal and professional growth. Thank you, Fortune Cookie. I never understood the lucky numbers. But that's probably because there has never been a single point in my life where I have taken a fortune cookie seriously. And not only is the shell hollow, but the words they speak are generally hollow. They don't really mean anything of substance. At best, maybe there's some broad, fluffy, sentimental statement being made. The book of Proverbs in the Old Testament can sometimes feel like a list of statements you might find on a fortune cookie. At least they could fit on one in many instances. Some of these proverbs are weird. They're easy to disregard and to throw out. Are these phrases hollow? Are they full of lies? Some may even, while not literally, leave a bad taste in the mouth after we read them and we think, what is going on here? The book of Proverbs is what is called wisdom literature. It's part of a wisdom trilogy in the Bible. The other two books of that include Job and Ecclesiastes. Wisdom literature tends to be idealistic in nature. It's probable texts, which basically means if you do this, it doesn't guarantee a certain outcome. It doesn't necessarily guarantee the outcome you are looking for, but it is more probable that that outcome will occur. For example, there's a proverb that talks about raising up your children in fear of the Lord and on the path so they don't stray from it. Now, does raising up your children to fear and honor the Lord automatically mean that they are going to grow into their adulthood to fear and honor the Lord? Well, no. That's not a guarantee statement, but it is a probable text, meaning that if you do this, your children are much more likely to fear the Lord into their adulthood. We're going to take some time this morning to look at 3 proverbs. And from these, we're going to unpack their meaning and also learn some of the ways that we can better read this book of wisdom, even on our own time. So first, we're looking at Proverbs 13, verse 24, which says, "Whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them." If you've ever heard the phrase, "spare the rod, spoil the child," this is where that's coming from. Except it's not exactly what the verse says. What Proverbs 13:14 is basically saying, if we're going to put this in a little bit more clean language, would be, if you don't discipline your children, you hate them, but if you love them, you will discipline them. Still, that's difficult to digest, especially when we miss some of the linguistic things going on. So one of the ways to better understand a proverb, and really this applies to a lot of different parts of Scripture. But especially when we're looking at a proverb, one of the ways to better understand it is to look at some of the words and study what those mean. The word rod here is pretty important. Now, rod is not referring to just a general stick. This isn't saying go to the hardware store, measure a certain stick, maybe no more than an inch thick, maybe no more than 2 feet long, no shorter than 1.5 feet, and get that to discipline your kids with. The Hebrew word for rod in this verse is shavet, which is the exact same word used in Psalm 23, verse 4, which reads, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." The rod in question is a shepherd's tool. This is the exact same word in both of these verses, but in our culture, we have a very different reaction to the use of this in Proverbs 13:24 than we do in Psalm 23, verse 4. A rod, when the Lord is our shepherd, is a comforting symbol. It's a comforting, protective thing that we think of. But when we look at something that says that we need to have the rod to discipline our children, this feels violent and abusive, even when it is the same word. But we need to understand then, what is a shepherd's rod? Now, a shepherd's rod was distinct from their staff. So their staff would be the long walking stick that has a curve on it, as you may see in many artist depictions of shepherds. And that was mostly used for walking. It wasn't often, it was sometimes used for guiding the sheep as well, or pulling them out of certain situations. But its primary focus, its primary use was for the shepherd to walk. The rod was the actual tool the shepherd used to guide the sheep. The shepherd did not run after the sheep, waving it around and beat them with it. Now, this is not a presentation of a theology of spanking or anything like that. Different forms of punishment like that and different forms of discipline like that are going to vary from child to child, and it requires a lot of individual discernment, family to family. For my family, one of us had to be spanked like every other day, and another one of us you would just look at with angry eyes. My parents would look at with angry eyes, and we wouldn't do anything wrong ever again. That one wasn't me. Appropriate discipline is not going too far to spare the rod, the guidance, the discipline, but also not going so far as to abuse it. Because sometimes there are those who will, as this verse warns, spare the rod. They'll throw it away. But the rod was a very important part of shepherding. Without the rod, a shepherd was limited to how they could guide their sheep. Without the rod, they could not properly defend their sheep. They also used the rod to fight off predators that would seek to get at their sheep. Sparing the rod in discipline is not love. And discipline is not always going to be comfortable. It shouldn't be comfortable. It's discipline. So, and again, this is going to look slightly differently for different families, different children, but the rod's intention here is an image of a parent or guardian shepherding their kids, guiding, keeping them on a path, not chasing them down and hitting them like the other extreme. Because the other extreme of discipline crosses the line from discipline into abuse, where there is no self-control, where there are no more boundaries, when discipline just becomes a disobedient child to hit, to yell at, to lock up in their room more hours of the day than they are out. There are abuses to this as well. So while we should not neglect discipline, Discipline needs to be controlled. Discipline needs to be, the verse actually says, those who love their children are careful to discipline. So not anxiously rushing to discipline, not chasing the sheep down, not chasing the children down to discipline, not excited to discipline necessarily even, but careful and thoughtful, wisely disciplining. That's that proverb. Again, we're just going to be jumping from proverb to proverb here. There's a lot that could probably be said on a lot of these. We're not going to get into the depth of every single part that you may want, but I encourage you, again, to study these for yourself and ask good questions if you have questions. Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. So this is kind of wordy, feels like a weird puzzle in some ways. But back to back, this verse just said, do not answer a fool according to his folly, or else. And then immediately, answer a fool according to his folly, or else. So which is it? Now, while the first half of these verses are identical, even to almost every linguistic part, kind of like we looked at with the last verse, these two first halves are identical. So we need to look at the second half to get more evidence as to what is going on here. So verse 4 basically says, do not answer a fool based on what they are saying, or you will be like them. While verse 5 is saying, answer a fool based on what they are saying, or they will think they are being wise since no one corrects them. This means that if we are to apply both of these verses today, what do we need to be paying attention to? We need to pay attention to what the fool is saying, and especially in our culture, the context, the place or medium in which they are speaking. And then we respond or do not respond accordingly. Today we have this incredible place where we can find fools everywhere we turn if we desire to surround ourselves by them. It's called the internet, and especially social media. Is everyone on there a fool? No, not necessarily. But a large portion of those who post their wisdom and thoughts on current events often are. When we see a social media post about something political, philosophical, religious, what have you, that we disagree with or we just know to be outright false, it is almost always better to apply verse 4. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be like him or like them. In other words, don't comment. Leave it alone. Don't engage that. And yes, this does still apply to in-person conversations. When this was being written, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have social media. So all they had was in-person conversations. But today, I think many of us have gotten far too comfortable with the safety of a keyboard to then engage in foolish conversations in a comment section. It's not that the things that are being discussed don't matter. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But either way, in this situation, this is not the context in which to reply to a fool. It is not the time to engage in dialogue. It is not the place to engage in dialogue with a fool, especially those you don't even know. If you're not going to see them in person to have the conversation, don't have the conversation. Do not answer a fool in the context of a social media comment section, or you will just look like them. Those who are looking at, that's often public, by the way. There's this thing called private messaging. That's not, well, they say it's not public. It's a whole other thing. But comment sections, large posts, people can see arguments happening. And most people aren't going to see one wise person and one foolish person. Anyone with discernment is going to see two fools bickering and arguing about something that either doesn't matter, or if it does matter, should not be a conversation had on the internet. Now, sometimes foolishness needs to be called out. This is where verse 5 comes in. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. So rabbis believed that verse 4 in this passage was about worldly things, and verse 5 was about spiritual things. Basically, don't engage in debate with people who are speaking foolishly about things of the world, but when it comes to things of the Lord, when it comes to spiritual matters, you need to intervene because those are important enough. Now, there's a lot of debate on whether or not these early rabbis were even correct in their interpretation of it, but it does give us at least a framework to approach a text like this and like verse 5. Today, this verse 5 is best applicable as understanding when to call somebody out on something they are doing or saying. And again, this should not be something publicly blasted out on social media. This is something in person. This is something that is done in your sphere, in your circle of influence. There are false teachers in the church, in globally around the world. There are people who teach in the church, for example, that teach false doctrine, that teach untrue things. We are called to call those people out, specifically if we find them in our field of influence. Because then they will believe what they are saying is wisdom, and they will lead other people astray into what is actually foolishness. Take, for example, a political leader. Calling them out does not mean posting something online that they are not going to see. Calling out a political leader is going to look for us much more like praying that those who know the Lord in their sphere of influence do it. That those who know the Lord in their sphere of influence approach them lovingly with wisdom. It is not for us to jump on something where they will not even see it or hear it. Call out foolishness in your immediate circle of influence, in person, face to face, and call it out for the purpose of making sure that that individual and others are not led down a path of destruction. All right, jumping to our next one here is Proverbs 23, verse 2. And put a knife to your throat if you are given to gluttony. Okay. So, gluttony is the sin of overindulgence in food. Gluttony is not saying, there's this growing teenager that can eat, they are a glutton. This 12-year-old just ate the entire Chinese buffet, even the fortune cookies. This kid is a glutton. That's not what this is talking about. Gluttony refers to those who eat simply for the sake and pleasure of eating. They're not trying to fulfill a need. They're trying to stimulate themselves through the pleasure of food. It's a worship of food. And here, in Proverbs 23, verse 2, we read that if you give in to this sin, put a knife to your throat. Yikes. What is going on here? And now this brings forth another important principle for interpreting Scripture in general, but this is very important to remember when it comes to understanding wisdom literature, especially something with smaller statements like Proverbs. We tend to read these verses in Proverbs like fortune cookie statements, but these verses don't exist in a vacuum. They sit within a broader context that cannot be ignored. When we zoom out to the surrounding verses, this is what we see in Proverbs 23, verses 1 through 3. When you sit to dine with a ruler, note well what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you are given to gluttony. Do not crave his delicacies, for that food is deceptive. Okay, so not necessarily less weird, not necessarily more helpful. Now food is deceptive. But this does give us more information to work with and some more cultural tools to work with. Immediately, we see that this verse is about dining with a ruler. This could have been a king. This could have been a wealthy individual with a lot of influence over a lot of land. Just somebody who is politically powerful in the context of this verse. And then understanding the food cravings. So throat in this verse, so back to some of the language here, throat to this verse also translates to appetite. It's the exact same Hebrew word. How do you put a knife to your appetite? You don't. Not literally. So this is more of speaking to it's essentially saying threaten your appetite at knife point. It's a little bit of an odd way of saying it, but be sure that your appetite, that you have it under control and it does not control you. But this is not actually, the core issue here in this verse is actually not gluttony. Gluttony is a sin, but that's not the main theme of what's going on here. Rulers and wealthy individuals at the time would invite people to meals, to feasts, to basically try to get in good and influence the person they were hosting. The book of Proverbs was written by a few different authors, but one of them is Solomon, and he's writing this to his son. Now, he had so many children, so it's not addressed to a specific one necessarily, but a lot of the wisdom in Proverbs is, yes, how to live a wise life, but also how to be a wise king in that day and age. People would invite the kings over to their homes, or other kings would invite them to their homes as a way to kind of make informal treaties, under the table, shady deals to politically manipulate those in power. So what this verse is saying is that food on the table is deceptive, not because the food is like grows a mouth and tells a lie. That food on the table is deceptive because it is actually a bargaining chip to try and get your ear, to try and manipulate you. This person, this ruler, is not necessarily being hospitable to you out of the kindness of their heart, but because they want something out of you. Now, last I checked, most of us aren't ruling any nations. But this verse, these passages still apply to us in that the core thing here is not gluttony, it is discernment. It is knowing and understanding and seeking out truth in a world that tells us lies. It is understanding. It is not being easily manipulated by just somebody who may be trying to take advantage of you or advantage of other people. Now, this is not to say be paranoid. This is not to say go buy a bunker, get a bunch of canned foods, dig it up for yourself, and hang in there until whatever blows over, you name it, and because you can trust no one. That is not what I'm saying. What this is telling us is that we need to treat a world that confuses foolishness for wisdom with a great degree of discernment, a great degree of thinking through things and understanding. It means that we, in Proverbs in general, this is the ultimate theme. That instead of just speaking and jumping into the foolishness of the world, we need to be a people who listens, who digests, who soaks things in, not for the purpose of fear-mongering and saying, don't trust X, Y, Z. Of course, there's always people we shouldn't be trusting. There's always teachings. There's always philosophies that we shouldn't be trusting. But so that we ourselves can be a people of wisdom. That we ourselves can be a people who doesn't bend at the will of just anybody who may want to manipulate us, but follows the will of the Lord. Proverbs is not a book of hollow sayings. It is not a book of lies. It's not actually even a book of guarantees. It is a book of tools for discernment that we are to take, that we are to seek to understand as deeply as we can, so that we can walk in a world that worships foolishness as a people of wisdom.